Well, hello there, students. It is good to be with you today for this beginning lecture of this course, where we are going to discuss the basics of moral philosophy. Now, for many of you, maybe indeed all of you, you signed up for this course not exactly knowing what's going on. You've went through the syllabus, you've looked it over, you've maybe a little bit intimidated by it. And frankly, I think when I was a college student, even a graduate student, syllabi always intimidated me a little bit. So that's par for the course. I think the reason why the syllabi are so intimidating is because we're really looking at the entire course in a matter of about, what the 30 or 45 minutes we took to look over it. So it seems like a lot, it's overwhelming. But now is where we start slowing down and taking it bit by bit. So keep that in mind. So what is moral philosophy? Well, we could answer that question maybe first of all by trying to figure out what philosophy itself is, um, which is a major question to try to answer. If I could just put it very succinctly, philosophy, at least in the academic setting, which is what this setting is the particular discipline, and I want to be careful here because philosophy is a discipline. After all, the philosophy is part of the title of this course, what this course is. Um, it has similarities to how maybe we generally use the term philosophy. Um, I've got a buddy who's who's what I might call a shade tree philosopher, and he'll often use the word philosophy uh, in the sense of little epithets such as, well, my philosophy is that what comes around goes around. Okay, so what does he mean by that? I guess he has some sort of belief that people get what they deserve, or that people will get dished back to them whatever they dish out to other people, right? This sort of thing. So he's got this view about how life is. And that's not necessarily the wrong definition or a wrong way to think about what philosophy. But in terms of philosophy for our course, we mean something a little bit different, something a little bit more specific. Sure, philosophies are life views, or I should maybe put it the other way around, that people's worldviews are life views, are philosophies for sure. But in the academic setting, what we are going to be doing is looking at the philosophy of professional philosophers who have really tried to get down to the deep questions or answers to those deep questions about life, about reality, and have tried to answer them in the best way that they can by uses of logic, of reason, of by the means given in that way. So philosophy can be about anything. One of the areas that is my specialization, I'll just share this with you, for instance, is the philosophy of knowledge, what's called epistemology. So I'm an epistemologist, and I've also have competences in work I've done in ethics and ethical theory. But in in epistemology, we're trying to answer the question about what knowledge is actually, and indeed, if there are certain kinds of criteria or certain kinds of standards or principles or norms, rules that would make a belief also an instance of knowledge, right? So really trying to get down to understand comprehensively what knowledge actually is. We use the term knowledge a lot. We use the term, or we'll use the phrase, I know what the answer is a lot, but do we really know what know means? Uh, well, let's apply that to morality now. We use morality a lot. We use ethics a lot. If I were to give you some awful, horrible story about someone who murdered somebody else, you would say, "Oh, that's awful," because what they did was wrong. It was ethically, morally wrong. They murdered somebody. Well, do we know? Do we really comprehend what moral wrong actually is in its essential, bare form? What is the reality to morality, or indeed, is there any reality to morality? So philosophers work to try to figure that sort of stuff out. They're trying to understand what the nature of morality is, what the nature of ethics is, and from there, uh, once they get that down, try to figure out if indeed we can have a sort of formula or structure, or list of ingredients that morality itself would require actions to have in order for those actions to be morally right actions or morally correct actions. So that's where we're at. That's what we're going to be doing in this course. So let's talk a little bit more about this by asking this question, what is ethics? And the way that our textbook will put it, and the way that a lot of philosophers will put it, is that another way to think about ethics is that it is moral philosophy. So for the purposes of our course, if we use the term ethics or if we use the term moral philosophy, we're going to kind of be talking about the same thing, just different ways of putting it. So what's moral philosophy then, or what is ethics? Well, it's the study of morality. And here we're not necessarily going to take a historical view, although that's going to be part of actually of what we do in a portion of this course, is looking at the history of ideas, at least when it comes to normative theories of morality, and a little bit later I'll describe what normative theories are. But even more so, we're going to be looking at sort of what people have said, what they've argued, what they've thought, and by people I mean professional thinkers here, and people who have been revered as being very influential in their ideas about morality, what they have thought about what morality is and how to achieve it. But it involves all kinds of things when it comes to people, right? Morality and ethics, oh my goodness, is something that we're always concerned with, we're always talking about. Twitter feeds are full of people trying to shame other people in terms of what they think they've done that's wrong or bad or could never be redeemed from, right? Of course, Twitter is a cesspool, and I stay away from it as much as possible. But I'm just mentioning it to give us an example of something we can think of right now anyway that kind of shows that, hey, yeah, we are concerned with morality. We are concerned with ethics. It is indeed on the mind of all of us as we go through life. So what does it involve? At a very basic level, it involves actions and behavior. And I think for the most part, we would point to this as being the most obvious point regarding what ethics is, or at least what it has to do with, what it's concerned with. It's concerned with how we behave. It's concerned with our actions. For instance, if I was to act out, let's say, by running a red light, which is rare. I rarely do that in my vehicle. Sometimes if I do it, it's because I'm oblivious, which is still my fault, I guess, not concentrating as much as I should. But would that be the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? And I think most of us would say, well, technically it's the wrong thing to do. It breaks the law. And one might argue that we have a moral obligation for the common good of our communities and our society to follow the law, because that's supposed to be the point of the law, is to help provide for good safety, for the flourishing of our communities. So I've done something wrong. And what is it there that has indeed signaled my wrongdoing, my being a really morally bad person? It's because of that particular action. So there we're looking at my action, not necessarily myself, but we could look at myself, I suppose, and my character, and that's something we'll talk about in due time in this course. But my actions, my behavior there in that case by running that red light was pretty bad behavior. Of course, I could think of worse scenarios than running a red light, but we'll just keep it there for now. So it involves actions and behaviors, right? This is a really crucially important part of morality, but also values. And it's related to actions and behavior because usually I would argue, and I'm being very sort of conservative in saying that, frankly, it's probably more like always, one's actions or behaviors are really just sort of reflections of their values. So if I'm running red lights all the time, then what that is expressing is my values regarding my own narcissism, I suppose. My value that I matter more than the common good or the common flourishing of the rest of my community, that I matter more than the law, that what I'm valuing is my own convenience, my time not being wasted, me getting my way, right? Those are the values that are informing my actions and behaviors. Well, something else that's concerned with moral ethics are going to be my beliefs also, my beliefs about a lot of things. And I might even, and I'm going to put this out there to you as we keep going down this list, is that my beliefs actually are going to inform my values. Why is it that I value myself over everyone else if I'm running red lights all the time, doing that bad behavior? Well, it's because I believe I'm more valuable, or I believe that I'm more important. I believe that what matters indeed is me. So my particular beliefs about how I see the world is going to be through the lens of me first. above everyone else and above everything else, everyone else and everything else. I put it that way. So yeah, I've got some beliefs that are informing those values. And what is it that's informing those beliefs? Well, it's probably going to be the reasons that I have for thinking that my beliefs are true about this. Maybe I have certain reasons that would make me think that my beliefs that I am more important than everybody else, that me first is the right way to think about the world, is correct, whatever those reasons might be. Right now on the fly, I really can't think of any. I guess because I picked a bad example, I really don't think I'm more important than anyone else. So I'm having a hard time coming up with some reason that thinks that's the case. Maybe I suppose one reason could be is that maybe I lived a life such that the only person that's really treated me well is myself. Right? So there you go. There might be a reason to support that belief that supports the values that guide how I act or how I behave. Right? So all of these things are interconnected. When we think about morality and when we try to study morality, we're really talking about we're really talking about this entire cluster of stuff, of concepts here that has to do with morality. And also with moral philosophy or ethics, whatever term we want to use here, it's going to be directed towards some notion of well-being. Indeed, that's what morality or ethics is geared towards. Put it differently, that's the point of being ethical. It's the point of being moral. It's the point of parents, for instance, teaching their children what is right behavior and wrong behavior is ultimately because we want to live in societies where people live well, where indeed we work towards some common goal for the common good of living a good life. And ethics is a way in which we try to structure that so that it is more, how do I put this, more conducive to achieving some notion of the well-being. This is why we think that you shouldn't murder people or rape people or steal from people or run over people who are walking down the sidewalk. I know these are some extreme examples, but they kind of help make the point here, right? Is because those kinds of things do the very opposite of its well-being for the community, right? Even for oneself. So, got to be careful about this and thinking about when you're driving and there are people walking down the sidewalk. Don't run over them because you will not achieve anyone's well-being in that case. So yeah, again, moral philosophy is about really a cluster of things that are involved with and geared towards our convictions, our beliefs about what well-being is and how to achieve it. So in the discipline of moral philosophy now, that is, this is an academic discipline. You are taking this course in order to study this academic discipline, do some work in it. There's three main branches of it. And in this, which is sort of an introductory course, I suppose, in this area, we're going to do a bit of an overview of these three main branches. There are metaethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. So I'm calling these the three main branches of moral philosophy. Question is, however, what exactly are these three different branches? Well, I think that a good way to put it is that metaethics is going to be the more abstract or the most abstract of the three. Normative ethics is a little bit more concrete, and applied ethics is really concrete. And I realize that those terms themselves are quite vague. So let me sort of illustrate them. And I want to do it with this chart, and I think that how I want to do this is actually start at the bottom. So let's start with applied ethics. So what I'm going to do actually is go to another slide here to talk about applied ethics, and then I'll return to where I was. So think about some issues that we have in applied ethics, okay? Things like the death penalty, abortion, animal rights, pornography, immigration, racism, and on and on and on it goes here on this list. These are called applied ethics because these are concrete, specific issues in which we try to figure out what it is that is the right thing to do. Let's pick euthanasia, for instance. It's up here on the top right hand of this slide. Euthanasia is the practice of killing people. I don't say murder because that's going to involve a value judgment. So that's often the dispute is whether or not it actually is murder. But we'll say killing, the ending of life, of someone because it's thought that they would be better off dead than alive. Euthanasia is practiced in the United States insofar that it is done in terms of assisted suicide, where a doctor will help a patient who voluntarily requests that they be euthanized, that they be killed. And it's usually done through a medication that's prescribed that the patient can take on his or her own that will indeed end their life. In several states, this is allowed. Not all states. However, every few years, a couple more states do start allowing it. So let's talk about that, for instance. So that's an issue. I mean, that's a really important ethical issue. Should people be allowed to take their own life? We generally think that suicide itself is something that people ought not to do, that it's morally wrong. However, we rarely, after all, I mean, we rarely celebrate that someone actually killed themselves. We usually think that this is a horrible tragedy. And generally speaking, I think a lot of us who have friends that have taken their lives this way feel somewhat morally responsible, morally culpable even, and somewhat blameworthy that we didn't know better or didn't take the time or whatever to maybe even help step in before things got that bad for them to do that. So I think generally we think that suicide is bad. Well, what about assisted suicide and euthanasia? A lot of people will argue that, hey, it's a morally okay thing to do if someone consents to it and gets a doctor to help them do it. It's just like any other medical procedure. But then you have other people who say this is not medicine at all. Medicine is about helping people. It's about preserving life. It's not about helping them to prematurely take their own lives just because they want to escape a bunch of stuff, right? I mean, how selfish or narcissistic can you be, right? So again, so now we have two different sides to this issue. How do you resolve it? Well, we need to be able to apply moral principles to that to get our solution. And this is where normative ethics comes along. So this is the next part in that original chart that I gave that I will eventually get back to here. And what is it that normative ethics do? Well, normative ethics is the branch of ethics that's concerned with providing theories that are to help us figure out what the right thing is to do in situations such as euthanasia, or such as abortion, or capital punishment, or pornography, or racism, or all these other things that I had on this slide right here. How do we solve the moral problems with these? That's what normative ethics here tries to do. And in this course, we will look at three specific theories of normative ethics, or generally, for short, what we'll call normative theories. We'll look at the virtue ethics of the ancient Greeks, and the specific philosopher we will look at is Aristotle here. We will look at his particular version of virtue ethics. And I do that because it's, frankly, it's more popular. It's more developed than others, than Plato or the Stoics or anybody else who had a version of virtue ethics. And it's been the one that academic philosophy, at least in the past 2 centuries, has appealed to the most of all the different theories of virtue ethics. We'll also look at Kant's deontology. Kant had a norm theory that argued that you can figure out the right thing to do by figuring out what's most rational to do. What does rationality itself demand? It's not the easiest theory to grasp. It's a bit difficult. We'll spend a little bit of time going through it to try to help make it as simple as possible. But that has been a very influential theory. Some people have argued, and I think they're correct with this, that the American judicial system itself, for instance, is very deontological in terms of the sort of philosophical foundations that undergird it, especially when you look at how courts, and upper level courts, I should say, make decisions on the basis of law, often do it in a more deontological kind of way. Ronald Dworkin, for instance, is a philosopher of law. Seems to really make that argument very clear, and I personally think he's right about that. So it's very influential. I mean, deontology is something we need to look at and make our own connections about how it's influenced the way we think about morality nowadays. And then after that, our third normative theory that we will look at is the theory of utilitarianism that is offered by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, both Englishmen from a few centuries ago. They thought that the way that you would figure out whether some action is right or wrong totally has to do with the consequences that would come about. If they're good consequences, well then yeah, it's morally right to do. If there's going to be bad consequences, well then it's going to be the wrong thing to do. Sounds very simple. I think in a sense, there's in a lot of cases we already do that sort of thing personally when we try to make decisions about what to do. We try to make a decision about what the possible consequences are and what the probable consequences will be, and then make decisions like that. But again, just like we have with applied ethics relies on this in order to uh, inform it about how to make decisions regarding certain ethical problems. But even these normative theories themselves assume something about morality. And what they assume about morality is that it's real. So if we think of normative ethics as falling under this particular category on the far left of this slide, realism, what's realism? Well, realism is simply a position that says that morality itself is real. It's as real as the rocks and the grass in your front yard. Obviously, you can't see it like you can see the rocks and the grass in your front yard because it has a conceptual nature, not a physical or empirical nature like the rocks and grass have. It has a conceptual nature, but it is a real nature nonetheless. And so all of the three major normative theories assume that morality is indeed real because all kinds of moral claims can have truth values or do have truth values. That is, it could either be true or false. It's going to be one or the other. So if I was to say something like abortion is morally wrong, now that's a moral claim. And what realism says is that that claim is either true or it's false. It can't be neither, and it can't be both. So what it's saying then is that indeed morality is a real thing. Now, whether or not we can figure it out or determine it, that's another question. I mean, that's going to be the more difficult one. But nonetheless, the assumption is that morality is indeed real and that it has a nature that transcends even human beings. In other words, humans don't create morality. They try to discover the morality that's already there, that's already part of the furniture of the world. That's what realism is. Well, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about realism, so I don't want to get into that too much right now. But realism gets us into the foray of metaethics now. So we've talked about applied ethics, we've talked about normative ethics, and now we've got metaethics. And here's what metaethics is. It is that branch in moral philosophy that is really dealing with what the nature and meaning of morality is. Maybe you've never thought of this, but if you have ever told anybody in your life that they did something that's wrong or they did something that's right, you could only say that because you are working off some assumption that you have about the nature of morality. Maybe you have assumed your entire life that it's a real thing, or maybe you have assumed all your life that it's not a real thing. It's just something that we construct and do. Either way, you've assumed something that you haven't actually spent a lot of time thinking about and examining for yourself. You've just assumed it. Well, all the things that we assume in that way regarding morality have to do with metaethics. So for instance, right, there's realism, and we've talked about realism, but there's also another view called non-realism that will say that moral claims have truth values, that abortion is morally right or wrong as a claim is either going to be true or false. But the reason it's true or false doesn't have to do with the reality of the world. What makes it true or false either is our own subject, that is our own person, that is that as individuals we determine morality for ourselves, and that's what makes it a real thing. Or what makes it a real thing is our culture, our society. We just kind of go along with that. And then there's a completely other position in metaethics that will say that moral claims don't have truth values at all. That a claim like abortion is morally wrong is never true, it's never false, because such claims have no cognitive value that way. All that moral claims are just a way of saying boo or yay, like you would to your favorite flavor of ice cream or a less than favorite flavor of ice cream. One particular view is emotivism, and that's what it says, that really when we make moral claims, we're just expressing emotions. We're expressing an emotional response to certain things that we like or don't like. Again, that's something that we'll talk about in more detail throughout the course, or let's just say later on in the course. However, right, we're taking this sort of 30,000 foot view from the air. as to what these three branches are. All right, so now I'll go back to that slide I kind of started with. Now we've got a better sense of what it is. So let's start now at metaethics. What is metaethics? It's the area that deals with things like what does right and wrong mean. Again, if you've ever told somebody that they did the right thing or the wrong thing, you've assumed that you know what that means. But do you really know what that means? I mean, metaethics is the sort of branch of moral philosophy where we try to figure that out. What do these things even mean? What do those terms even represent or point to? So again, then what does morality consist of? What is its basic nature? Do moral facts exist? Facts like 2 plus 2 equals 4, that's a fact that definitely exists. Or that George Washington was the first president of the United States, that's a fact that exists. Well, if morality has a true, real nature, then claims such as abortion is morally wrong is going to be a fact, or abortion is morally permissible is going to be a fact. Either one of those claims will be a fact given what the nature of morality is. We generally, in our culture, and I think it's mostly because we're very much influenced by secularism in the West nowadays, and we're very much more influenced in sort of the, how do I put it, seem to be convinced that the answers to these questions can never be found. So we tend to think that, I say this sort of as a general American society, we tend to think that moral facts don't exist for those reasons. But of course, that's something that could never actually be proven that they don't exist. But it's a question worth pursuing. Just like I say in the next line, what's worth pursuing? What benefits us? If morality is about trying to help secure the good life, then indeed, what is the good life? And does our ethics actually help us achieve that? So these are the very basic, foundational, meta level stuff to ask. And why go meta? Because it's beta. Sorry, I just had to throw that in there. So that's metaethics. Then at normative ethics, whatever our answers are in metaethics will help inform our normative ethics, where we will actually sit down and figure out what the principles of morality then are, what its standards are, what it is that need to be the rules for morality. And so in normative ethics, all normative theories are going to assume a very specific metaethics. And I showed you that on the previous slides, that they assume that morality indeed is real and that moral claims have truth values. So armed with those convictions, assuming that morality indeed does exist on its own, it's part of the furniture of the world in which we live in, it's thus up to us to discover what those principles are and figure out how to disseminate them. So moral principles then are discovered, delineated, systematized, so that we can come up with formulas that we can use in order to figure out what's morally right or wrong. Hopefully before that we do that action or thing that we're concerned about whether it's morally right or wrong. And then once we have these principles and we have these theories for figuring this stuff out, that is what we will apply to specific cases or problems. So applied ethics is, again, where we are applying our normative theories to specific issues, to porn, to euthanasia, to abortion, to capital punishment, and so on and so forth. Again, going back through the slides that I skipped ahead to earlier to try to help explain this stuff. One of the best ways, I think, to illustrate moral philosophy and the sorts of problems that we're going to try to provide answers to in a course like this is what a philosopher from the 1950s, Philippa Foot, came up with, the trolley problem. And this is such a great illustration because you're going to find that with the stuff we look at later on in this course, it's almost like they are all, even though they're very different, pornography, euthanasia, immigration, abortion, capital punishment, animal rights, whatever topic we're going to be looking at in this course, they are all, in a sense, kind of versions of the trolley problem, in a sense. Well, let me give you what the trolley problem is. So very basically, it's this. There's a trolley that is going down a track. I know this is really heavy stuff right now, but just stick with me. A trolley is going down the track, and it will be it is on track to run over 5 people who are on that track. It's going to run over them, and the trolley weighs so much, it's going to cut them up to bits and they will all die. Sorry for the graphic nature of it, but welcome to college. All right, so it's getting ready. It's fixing to kill these people. Now you are the bystander, and you see that this is going to happen, and you notice that there is a switch that would allow you to divert this trolley over to a spur track. And on that spur track, there is only one person tied to that track. Now, let me say this. I don't know why these people are tied down. I have no clue if it's a joke or a prank or whatever. This is just a thought experiment, so we don't want to analyze it too much here, right, into all that what's going on. It's just the reality of what is. There's 5 people on one track, and there's one person on this spur track. It is within your power to pull that lever as this guy is standing there and has this sort of dumbfounded look on his face. He's trying to figure out what to do, to divert that trolley and just kill the one. So the question is, would it be the morally right thing to do to pull the lever so that only one person dies instead of 5 people, or to not pull the lever whereas 5 people will die and the one person will not? So it's going to depend really on what theory of morality you think works best. If you're utilitarian and consequences is what matters, then you might say, well, of course, right? More lives will be saved if I pull the lever, and hence the trolley itself will be diverted and it will kill one person instead of 5. So by raw numbers, more people survived than got killed. You might think that was the morally right thing to do for that particular reason. If you're, however, a Kantian, if you're a deontologist, it would be irrational, for reasons we'll get to later on in the course, it would be irrational to do anything that would cause death. So you shouldn't pull the lever because you would actually be culpable. You would be blameworthy. You would actually have caused the death of one person. Whereas if you didn't pull the lever, didn't even touch the lever, you wouldn't be blameworthy for doing anything, right? You would not be responsible for anything that happened. The trolley merely ran over 5 people. Although other people, that is other right thinkers and critics of that, might say that, well, but you still allowed it to happen, and you could have done something in your power to not allow it to happen. And then we often get into these very difficult and long debates about whether or not there is a moral difference between doing something bad and allowing something bad to happen. That can often turn into a very difficult and a very long and boring conversation. But it's a great question, right? Is doing something bad worse than merely allowing something bad to happen when you have it in your power to not allow it to happen and do something that might be better? So we can see how in this sort of thing, it can be very difficult and very hard to get through and try to figure out, because there's really a lot going on behind it. So yeah, this is the trolley problem. Most people, what I have found, that is, most students will take the option of pulling the lever, that the right thing to do here is to pull the lever so that only one person dies instead of 5. A vast majority of students will say that's the right thing to do. But they will absolutely change their tune when I pose this problem to them. And this is how Judith Jarvis Thompson, a philosopher at MIT for many years now, modified Foote's original trolley problem. So here's the modification, is that the trolley is going down the track. Again, I know real heavy stuff here. And it is fixing to hit and kill 5 people who are tied to that track. Now, that's just what it's going to do. However, you have the power, you have the ability to push this large guy, and actually Thompson calls him Fat Man. You have the ability to push Fat Man over the bridge onto the track. And Fat Man has within himself the ability to completely stop the trolley and save the 5 people. However, Fat Man himself indeed will die as a result of the impact. Using him will save the 5 people. However, right, he will die as a result of it. He will be sacrificed in order to do this. Now, when I ask students in class, what's the right thing to do here, the vast majority of them who said in the previous example, pull a lever, here will say do nothing. And I ask them why. And they say, well, because it would be wrong to push the guy over the bridge and sacrifice him in order to save the 5 who are tied to the track. But my question is, how is it really different? Because here, if you pull the lever, you're sacrificing 1 life in order to save 5. And here, again, if you push Fat Man over, you'd be sacrificing 1 guy, 1 person, in order to save 5. It's the same thing, right? At least that's how I generally think about it, and that's Thompson's point here. So why is it that we're more apt to say pull the lever here and don't push the Fat Man over here? Well, a lot of people will say, well, because it's icky, you've got to put your hands on him and push him over. Where here you're just pulling a lever, right? There's a nice comfortable distance where you can sort of, it doesn't seem as human to you as in this case. Well, that might be true, but nonetheless, arguably, you're being incredibly inconsistent, I would think, and Thompson thinks, if you hold that position. If you're not actually following through and being consistent in either one. Well, that's what moral philosophy is trying to do. Trying to figure out how to be consistent in every case regarding our moral theories and how we apply them, to those cases, to those issues. And that's a lot of what this course is going to be about, is trying to solve this trolley problem in the specific moral problems and issues and topics we'll be looking at for this course as it applies in those cases. And being consistent. If you're going to be consistent in one case and say, for instance, that let's say, for instance, you may have the position that abortion is morally wrong, that euthanasia and assisted suicide is morally wrong. That's great. It's great you have that position. It's great you have whatever position you have. But if you indeed have that sort of pro-life position, what about capital punishment? What if you also think that capital punishment or the death penalty is a morally right policy to have in terms of how we give punishment in our society? And how are you going to rectify those two, or how are you going to make those two consistent? Because it seems like you're arbitrarily picking life in one or two of those cases and then saying that life doesn't matter in the latter case, that is regarding capital punishment. So I'm not saying that there's not answers to these problems, but I hope that in this course you're going to be challenged, and that's the point, really, to be challenged to think about having a consistent moral framework and understanding how that the history of moral philosophy helps us try to achieve that in what we're doing.